First, he forgets to secure the boat. Then he forgets to secure the forklift. And you get the idea. Talk about not learning from your mistakes.
That is just incredible no matter how many times you see it, I gotta tell you. Any other boaters there? How many of you are boaters? Can you relate? I mean, we've been boating as a family for years now, but I remember the first time I got behind the wheel of the boat, and I'm really glad that it was grainy enough you couldn't see that was me. No, I'm kidding. But I remember, because you've been driving for years, and I'll tell you, friction and gravity are your friends. Like when you're driving, friction and gravity are really, really nice things. And if you've ever piloted a boat, you just don't have that, I've got a boat similar to that, and it's a 21-foot, and I'll tell you, like you're just out there, and you've got wind, and you've got waves, and you've got currents, and it's just really complicated. And I remember the first summer I was learning really how to pilot a boat. It was really difficult. And we always go to this place up in Halliburton for a week of vacation, and it's got a lake nearby, and I had our boat. And I'll tell you, I was so bad because the real test is docking. Like, docking is extremely difficult when you bring your boat in. And I quickly got a reputation for being the worst docker at the lodge. And people would gather at the shoreline and place bets on how many times it would take for me to really land this thing. But it's difficult. And we all do that, right? It's like, hey, check out this guy, or hey, look at this guy, or ha, 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 ha. And the question I want to start with as we move into the final part of a series that we're calling Alt Kingdom. And the big idea, if you're just joining us for the first time, if you're watching for the first time or listening for the first time, is that Jesus says, I'm bringing in an alternate kingdom, a different kingdom from the world. And if you look at what's going on in the world, you would say, I would sign up for another kingdom, which is a good thing. But the idea that a lot of us have with Christianity or with Jesus is that, oh yeah, your kingdom starts in heaven. It starts after we die. And Jesus says, no, it starts now. It's about heaven, but it's about today. It's about tomorrow. And the idea is for that kingdom to take root in our lives. And so we have been working through 3 of the most famous chapters in the book of Matthew, which tells the story of Jesus' life. We often call these teachings the Sermon on the Mount, and we're going to get toward the end of it today. And Jesus basically says this. He says, listen, if you build your life on this stuff that I'm teaching you, you will build it on a solid rock. If you build your life on this stuff, when the storms of life come, you're going to be okay. So you don't have to wait for heaven for this kingdom. But here's a question I want to start with, which will get us into today's text. What makes you feel like a success? And some of you are like, I wish I felt like a success, okay? I don't feel like a success. I don't feel like a success at all. Some of you, you're saying, you know what? It's going okay. Like, I feel all right. What makes you feel like a success? And so often the answer to that question on our bad days is other people's failures. You know what makes me feel like a success? It's when somebody else messes up. You look at that guy and you're like, yeah, I'm not having such a bad day, I guess, right? And that happens. I believe in counseling. I've gone to counseling for years. We encourage you to get counseling. We have some counselors we trust and would love for you to see one because they help us work through a lot of things in our life. And a few years ago, I was seeing my counselor and he introduced me to this term as I was working through an issue that I'd never really heard. I don't know whether he made it up or who made it up. But the term is simply this. It's comparigance. And it's a combination of comparison and arrogance, which is really interesting. And if you think about how judgment works, it sort of works like this, that when other people fail, right, you kind of put yourself up on this little step stool. And I don't know whether you've ever done this. I've definitely done this because I tend to be a judger. I am naturally somebody who judges other people. It is not that hard for me to do that. But you think, well, I'm a little better than, and maybe it's at least I'm a little better than, or at least I'm a little smarter than, or maybe you're taller than, or faster than, or more successful than. Or maybe you think I do social media better than. or I look better than, or I am better than, or I'm more successful than, or I have higher grades than, or we're growing faster than. And you know what he says that is? It's comparigance. That it's arrogance based on comparison. And what you do when you do comparison or comparigance is you just put yourself up just a little bit higher than somebody else to make yourself feel good. And so you realize, no, I'm not the best in the world. I'm not the best in the country. I'm not the best at this, but I'm a little bit better than my relative. I'm a little bit better than her, a little bit better than my neighbor. We keep our yard better than they keep their yard. You know, we had a better vacation then. Whatever that is, he says, you know what that is? It's comparigance. And it's ugly. A few years ago, we're looking at the Gospel of Matthew today, but when I was in my 20s, I was reading through Ephesians, which is a letter that Paul wrote to the church in Ephesus. And it talked about how to speak the truth in love. And I remember that I was reading the passage that day. I had this thought, and I've tried to live by it because I need to live by it, because otherwise I'm not going to live by it. But it's simply this. Never build yourself up by tearing others down. And this can be a real challenge for a lot of us because it is so easy, particularly if you don't feel good about yourself, like maybe you're disappointed in yourself, or maybe you think you don't measure up. But sometimes what you do, particularly when you're in a weak spot or not in a good day, is you build yourself up by tearing someone else down. That happens in marriages all the time. Happens in parenting. It happens at work, where there's that guy, because you don't have a lot of control over work. So you just, imagine this person's your enemy and you don't like that person and you kind of build yourself up by tearing that person down. Or another way to put it is this: someone else's failure should never make you feel like a success. And if you want to get into that space, that gets us into the territory that Jesus was talking about toward the end of the Sermon on the Mount, where in Matthew chapter 7, we're going to look at 6 verses. You don't need any more. They are powerful enough. And if you hear them right, they're going to really shock you. They're really going to, you're going to go home struggling. I had some conversations after the first service and people are struggling. And that means you heard the text. Now, I should say something because I've got some feedback. It's like, wow, this second part of the series, the last 2 weeks, has felt hard, like really hard. It doesn't feel like our normal style. So what I try to do as a preacher, and I don't always get this right, but I try to reflect the text. And these are hard texts. They're some of Jesus' most powerful words, some of his best known words, but they're also really difficult texts. And so sometimes, if I'm harder than the text, then that's a mistake. If I'm harsher than the text, then that's my bad. But sometimes the text is just hard. And we have this idea, particularly in our country, that God is just love and he's a big marshmallow and everything's great and everything's good all the time. And that may be spirituality, but it's not Christianity. And if you really want to wrestle with Jesus, you have to wrestle with the whole Jesus. And Jesus is saying, you want to build your life on something solid? You want to build yourself on a kingdom that works? You got to build yourself on a kingdom that is an alternative, that is something different to the kingdom of this world. And he says, the kingdom of the world is going to do things one way. My kingdom happens another way. So what Jesus is doing in these antitheses, as scholars call them, is he's saying, this is what you're going to do if you live in that kingdom. Don't do it. So it's a whole lot of don't, but it gets us to a do that is so powerful. So anyway, let's look at that. With that in mind, Jesus says, when it comes to judgment, when it comes to this, when it comes to just making yourself a little bit better, smarter, thinner, whatever that is, I'm just a little more than this, at least I'm not like that, that involves judgment. And when it comes to judgment, Jesus says, verse 1, do not judge others. Just don't. Just don't, which is really challenging for somebody like me. So I've been in leadership all of my adult life, and with the kind of work that we do, that a lot of you do, you ever find yourself at work in like a brainstorming meeting? It's like, we're going to brainstorm for a half hour. And I would always initiate those, but I know that I'm really bad at that because I have an instant opinion about everything. And so somebody says, well, why don't we do this? I'm like, well, that's dumb. Oh, that actually slipped out. That kills brainstorming, but it's really hard for me. It's really hard for me to keep my mouth shut because I have an instant opinion on just about everything. And Jesus says, yeah, Carey, don't. Just don't. Don't judge other people. Don't judge others. But then he says something really interesting, because, if we're honest, we're all judgers of one kind or another. And maybe you think of yourself, well, I'm not a judgmental person. And we live in what we think of as a non-judgmental culture because we're so tolerant. But I know a lot of people who say, I am tolerant. I tolerate anybody or anything, except, there's always an except, what do they not tolerate? Intolerant people. You ever notice that? I'm so tolerant unless you're intolerant, then I'm not tolerant of you, which is really interesting. I think at some level we're all judgers. And we all have our different criteria. Maybe it's like you judge people the way they parent their kids, or you judge somebody's car, or you judge someone the way they keep their house, or you judge the way somebody works, or the fact that they seem to be lazy, or you judge your neighbor, or you judge your spouse. If you're in a relationship, if you're married, you're pretty good at judging, because that's where all your fights come from. And Jesus says, don't. And we could leave it there, but then he adds a lot of context. He says, and this is fascinating, do not judge others, and you will not be judged. Now, what he uses here, this is it's a passive verb tense. And in the scriptures, this verb tense is often used. And theologians, biblical commentators, they call it the divine passive, because you'll notice the subject is missing. Well, judged by whom? And the answer is by God. By God. Wait. So don't judge others. Why? Because I will not be judged by God? How does this work? And then Jesus gives us some more clues. He says, for you will be treated as you treat others. You mean in this life? Well, to some extent. If you're the jerk at work, always judging people, people aren't going to warm up to you. That's the way it goes. But he's saying this is something bigger than that. That's maybe the way your Heavenly Father will treat you. And if you think, well, that's a weird interpretation, just go back to where we were last week. Look at chapter 6. Look at the Lord's Prayer. It says, forgive others Father, forgive us as we have forgiven those who sinned against us. And then it says, by the way, if you do not forgive other people, your Heavenly Father will not forgive you. And all of a sudden this shows up. What? He's going to judge you and treat you the way you treat other people. A few years ago, we referenced this earlier. We did a series called Imagine Heaven, based on the book called Imagine Heaven, where John Burke contrasted near-death experiences with scriptural accounts of the afterlife. And it's fascinating, recommended reading. But in so many of the near-death experience cases, you know what people got? Because they're near death. They don't stay dead. You don't hear those stories. So these are people who claim to have died and come back, okay? But one of the common threads is that they had what they called a life review. And in that life review, what seemed to be the common denominator there is they saw their whole life unfold before them. And what they recoiled over, what they were so struck by, was how nastily they treated other people. And they were horrified by it. And when they came back to life, again, you should read the book, because I know you're probably like, near-death experiences, really? You got explanations for that? It's a fascinating book. When they came back to this life, they changed. And Jesus says, your Heavenly Father cares about how you treat other people. And maybe, what if you got treated the way you treat other people by God? He keeps going with this. He says, the standard you use in judging is the standard by which you will be judged. So how would you like to be judged the way you judge other people? Like, how would you enjoy that? Jesus is asking the question. It's a great question. And when I look at that, I'm like, uh-oh. I can't even drive anywhere without judging people who are too slow or in the wrong lane, or people who are responsible for slow internet. I have trouble with all of that. And I get impatient because I'm driven and ambitious and all those things. And it's like, okay, well, the standard you use is the standard by which you'll be judged. Wow. So let's take a break, because that's a lot of truth. And again, it's a hard teaching. And ask a bigger question. How does judgment work? How does judgment work? And this is just my thinking. This isn't what Jesus thought. This is just my thinking on what Jesus taught. I think underlying my judgment, your judgment, are three things. See if this resonates with you. So when you judge somebody, are these three things underneath. Number one, I know. I know. Because judgment assumes you know. It's like, that's a dumb idea, because you know, right? Or that isn't right, no. Or that was the wrong model of car. Or why did they do that to their place? Who thought that was a good color? I know. Or why did you think that was a great idea? Why did you think that was a good strategy? Why did you think that was a good place to vacation? I know. I know. I know. I know. I know, and I'm right. See, think about this. Every time you judge someone, isn't that true that you think you know, you think you're right, and this is where it gets nasty. I'm better. I'm better. So you just kind of stand up and you're like, I know, I'm right, and I'm better. And when you really hold that out to daylight, that's like, that is ugly. The reality is, with judgment, you don't always know, you're not always right, and you're certainly not always better, and every once in a while we get humbled. So when my wife and I were married, it was between years at law school, when we were at law school, and we took a break, and we went for our honeymoon. We were fortunate enough to be able to go to Portugal and Spain. And we had no money, but we still found discount airlines, we got over there, and it was an incredible trip that we look back on with great affection. But it was like, I was 25, so here's a picture of us on our honeymoon. That's actually me. Conan O'Brien and I had the same hairstylist back then. So that's us, that's me at 25. I'm glad that short shorts are back. You just wait long enough, eventually everything comes back into style. But maybe they're not. Anyway. So we decide to go and explore the Spanish coastline. It was absolutely beautiful. And you got to remember, okay, we got married before not only there were iPhones and not only before Google Maps, but before MapQuest, like even that long ago, where people actually used paper maps. Does anyone remember that? Your marriage is in so much better shape since the invention of Google Maps than it was with paper maps, just so you guys know. But we're using these paper maps to navigate. We're going to these little villages, and we went to this little village, and there's castles everywhere in Europe, right? So we want to go see this castle. So we go up, and it's almost like you would see in a storybook. It's like just this thing with a road that goes up and up and up in circles to the very top. At the very top is the town. At the very top is this castle. So we spend time there, and nobody there, there's no tourists who go there. And this is pre-Google Translate, so we didn't speak Spanish. They didn't speak English. But we had a good time. We saw the castle, and then it was time to go back. And I'm sitting there with the map trying to figure out, Tony and I are trying to figure out how do we get down, and we can't figure it out. We can only see one road. And that road was one way, and the way was up. And we're like, do you just come up to this village and you die here? What happens? I couldn't really figure it out. Maybe there's no escape. And so we couldn't talk to anyone because we didn't speak Spanish. So I thought, well, we're just going to drive down. So I start driving down this one-way street the wrong way because it's the only way I could figure that out. Well, the townspeople noticed. So we start being greeted by people coming out of their shop going, no! There are grandmothers chasing us with brooms. We're being chased all the way down, and I'm like, we got a car, and they don't. And I'm just like, boom, straight down this thing, and we live to tell the story. But in those cases underlying my judgment, I didn't know, I wasn't right, and I wasn't better. I just couldn't figure it out. And that's the problem with your judgment, is you're not always right. You don't really know. And you're not always better. And there's another problem with judgment that I've noticed in my own life. And that is, you can't judge somebody and love somebody at the same time. Think about this if you're married, if you're dating, if you're engaged, if you're in love. You get mad, you're in love for 5 minutes perfectly, and then reality shows up. And when you're judging, at the heart of most of your arguments and disagreements is judgment. And what's at the heart of that judgment? It's this idea that you know, and you're better and you're right. And those, in my life anyway, seem to be incompatible with love. That when I'm judging you, I'm not loving you. And when I'm loving you, somehow that seems to preclude judgment because it gets rid of, I'm right, I know, and I'm better. And you're like, well, what happens when they're not right? So are you saying nobody's right? Like, you're not always right. Is nobody right? Like, how does that happen? Well, the reality is some of the people that you're with, of course they're going to be wrong. And of course you're going to be wrong. And we're all wrong, and we all make mistakes. But here's what's true. You're dealing with broken people, but the brokenness of other people should break your heart, not harden it. You know what happens with judgers, with those of us who naturally judge, is we just harden our hearts. That's what's happening in your relationship. That's what's happening with your parenting. That's what's happening with the people at work, is your heart isn't open anymore because you just judge them. And so the brokenness of other people, because we're broken, they're broken, I'm broken, you're broken, the brokenness of other people should break your heart, not harden it. And when I kind of forget that, I ask myself this question back to Jesus' teachings. Well, what if God treated me as harshly as I am treating others? What if God treated you as harshly as you're treating your spouse? As harshly as you're treating that kid who drives you nuts in your home? As harshly as you're treating the guy at work you can't stand? As harshly as you're treating your neighbor that you really wish you could move away from? What if God started treating you as harshly as you treated them? See, there's a lot here, isn't there? And you're like, okay, that's great. So what does this mean? We just wash our hands, we all walk away, we become indifferent? Or we can't help anybody? Like, how does that actually work out? Are you saying you're always wrong and the other people are always right? Like, where does that leave us? Fortunately, Jesus continues. He says, and why worry about a speck in your friend's eye when you have a log in your own? So you're like, yeah, your friend's got a speck, but you have a telephone pole, Mr. Nieuwhof, and so you got to pay attention to that. And how can you think of saying to your friend, let me help you get rid of that speck in your eye when you can't see past the log in your own eye? And then he's back to where he's been for a couple of chapters. Nieuwhof, hypocrite, play actor. So, okay, now what? So I can't ever say anything to anybody anytime? Jesus says, no. First, get rid of the log in your own eye. First, get on your knees. First, have some humility. First, ask the question, what do I need to pay attention to? Where am I not measuring up? How am I messing up? First, get rid of the log, the problem in your own eye, and then, this is so powerful, then you will see well enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye. Your friend needs help. And you can help him, but first you got to deal with your stuff. Now that's powerful. So how do you do that? Like in a practical world, how do you do that? And a lot of the time what I've discovered, see whether you've discovered, is that people who are judging, sometimes it does come from a real sense of arrogance or hubris or narcissism, that they really do think they're God's gift to humanity. But a lot of the time the judgment that I see seems to come instead from insecurity. I don't feel that good about myself. I don't think I'm that successful. I didn't hit my goals. I'm not making straight A's. This family thing isn't working out the way I thought. I thought we'd be further ahead in life. I'm not as good a leader as I thought I was. Insecurity. And the second thing is, honestly, jealousy. It's jealousy. It's like, why are they thinner? Why are they better looking? Why are they more successful? Why do they have the better vacation? How come I didn't get more of that? See, a lot of our judging springs from those two sources. It springs from insecurity, and it springs from jealousy. I'm not as gifted. And if you really want to get to the root of it, you know who you're really mad at? God. Because you're like, why do they have it going on and not me? Why them, not me? How come? So you know what you do? And I got this from Andy Stanley. I read this over a decade ago. I've never found it said better. This is what you do. You celebrate what God has given others. It's like, Good for you. Good for you, you're getting married. Wish I was. Good for you. Good for you, you're pregnant, you're having kids. Good for you, you're getting into your dream home. Good for you, you got the promotion. Good for you, I'm glad. Tell me all about your holiday. Good for you. And you know what? Saying it out loud breaks the power of jealousy. Not just in your head. I mean, rather than deleting them as a friend, like their post. Then leave a comment, congratulations. You do that repeatedly, it will start to destroy jealousy. And so you start there. You celebrate publicly, out loud, even if you're gritting your teeth, what God has given others, and then leverage what God has given you. Because when you're jealous or you're insecure, here's the subtext in your mind. You're like, God hasn't given me anything. I don't have anything. Poor little me. It's not going so well. And what's wrong with me? And it's not good for me. And it's like, wait a minute. What you're saying is God didn't give you anything. That's actually not true. And you may think he did better with other people, but just leverage what he gave you. If he gave you 1 and you think he gave someone else 5, you leverage your little 1. That's what you do. This is so powerful. So if you're judging from a place of trying to build yourself up by tearing other people down, start here. Celebrate what God has given others. Leverage what God has given you. And then you can go deeper. Try this. Hold yourself to a stricter standard than you hold others. Rather than coming from here, start on your knees and say, what's wrong with me? All right, that person was ridiculous in that meeting, but when have I been ridiculous in that meeting? What would I do? And if you don't know, ask somebody. They will be happy to tell you what's wrong with you. All right, and then you can pray about it. They got a list, okay? So they got a list, and you need to figure that out. Hold yourself to a stricter standard than you hold others. Fortunately, for those of us who preach, like me, it says right in the scriptures, in the letter that James wrote, it says that those of us who teach will be held more strictly. We're going to be judged more strictly. So I better judge myself. I better hold myself up to a very bright light and spot the mess. You want to change your marriage? Hold yourself to a stricter standard than you hold others. Because you've spent most of your time trying to hold your spouse to a standard they don't want to be held to. And some of you are doing that to your kids, and some of you are doing that to the people in your life. Hold yourself to a stricter standard. And then do this. Fix yourself before you try to fix somebody else. Get the plank out of your eye before you address the speck. So fix yourself. It's confession and repentance. Oh my goodness, I need help. How about I go for counseling? Why don't I go to the first session? You go to the second, okay? It's like fix yourself before you try to fix somebody else. And then the third thing, and this has been really helpful, because it's not that you turn a blind eye or you pretend everything is wonderful all the time or you live in fluffy marshmallow land. I mean, that's not good. That doesn't help anybody. You've got to say what is right sometimes, but how do you get there? And I've found this, it sounds like a nuance, but I don't think it is. Don't judge, instead discern. So discern instead of judge. Discern instead of judge. So you can be discerning because, at work, particularly if those of you who are in leadership or in charge of something, yeah, that's your job. You get paid to discern. And there are better courses and worse courses. There are better things and there are worse things. In your family, you're paid to discern. What do you say to your kids? How do you navigate this as a couple? How do you navigate this as a single mom? How do you navigate this as somebody who's retiring? How do you navigate this as a student? You've got to discern. You've got to use your judgment, but you've got to avoid judging. So here's what I think the difference is between discerning and judging. You know what judgment does? Judgment walks away. Because you know, and you're right, and you're better, judgment walks away, and you're like, yeah, you're an idiot, and you just walk away. Judgment says, I don't care. Judgment is like, you turn your back. Because that's what you do. It's impossible to judge someone and love someone at the same time. So judgment walks away, but discernment is different. You know what discernment does? Discernment bends to help. Not because you're up there, but because often the person who needs help is down here. And so discernment comes down, and discernment says, all right, what can I do to assist? What can I do to help? And maybe you start by asking questions. And maybe you start by really reaching out. And maybe instead of letting judgment harden your heart, the brokenness of that person softens your heart. And you're there to help. Do you see the difference? Because when you're judging in your family, it's walking away, but discernment bends to help. And there's a humility. Even the posture starts with humility. And you don't have to go in as the person with all the answers. In fact, you might say, hey, I don't have all the answers. I haven't got it all figured out. But is there something I can do to help? See, judgment walks away. Discernment bends to help. And that's true at work. That's true in your family. It's true in your friendships. It's true in your neighborhood. It's true at school. Judgment will walk away. Discernment bends to help. Now, we're still not done. And again, the text gets complicated sometimes, and it gets hard. We're not done. These are just 6 verses, but there's actually one caveat. There's one little asterisk that Jesus puts in. He says, so always, always, always. Because some of you are like, okay, well, I have been down trying to help this person for a long time. And it's not going well. And it's difficult. Or there's this one person in my life that just seems to be resistant. And Jesus says, yes, that happens sometimes. So, last verse we're going to look at today. Don't waste what is holy on people who are unholy. Now, what does that mean? Is that like Christian, non-Christian? No. Holy simply means separate. It means don't waste what is from God. Don't waste what is from God on people who are continually resistant to the things of God. Now, that doesn't mean you stop praying for them, but some of you, you've been banging your head against a wall for a long time. You've been trying to help an addict who doesn't want help. You've been trying to help somebody who just spits in your face every time. And Jesus says, don't waste what is holy on people who are unholy. Don't throw your pearls to the pigs. They will trample the pearls, and then they'll turn and attack you. Now, that can be true of people who don't want help. That can be true of really angry people who write in all caps. Those can be true of people who just make your life difficult over and over again. There's this saying, this is not from the scripture. I don't know where it came from, but I think about it, and I think there's truth in it, particularly if you're online. You know those people who are always angry or who are like, I got a bone to pick with you? Here's the saying. Never wrestle with a pig. You both get dirty and the pig likes it. There's truth to that, right? There are some people, every once in a while I'll see a comment online. I'm like, I'm going to roll up my sleeves. I'm going to help. I'm going to jump in there. Not everybody's bad. And then you're like, why did I even bother, right? You know, and there are people, and listen, this is a tiny percentage. This is not 90%. This is not everybody. This is not your whole family. This is not everybody at work. But there are some people, it's just like, you know what, this is useless. And Jesus said there's a time like people will be, eventually have to, all of us have to give an account for our own life. And at some point, they're going to have to give an account for their life and how they lived it. And Jesus says, if you're dealing with that, at a certain point, you're enabling, you're not actually helping. So don't throw your pearls to the pigs. They'll trample the pearls. They'll turn and attack you. And you'll see this in the gospel. That Jesus said, hey, if there's not a good reception, you shake the dust off your feet and you move on. Maybe one day they'll come back to you and go, hey, remember you tried to help me, you tried to help me, you tried to help me? And you're like, yeah, I'm here to help. Do you want help? You know, Jesus asked this question in John chapter 5, and I love the question. I ask it all the time. And sometimes I'll ask people the version of this question, but it's simply this question, John chapter 5. Do you want to get well? And some people don't. Now, you don't have to spend your life there. There'll be a time where maybe they want to get well. Now, I don't know who that person is. That's why I'm glad that so many of you are in small groups, because you can go to group and say, so this one person in my life, can we talk about him or her today and get them to pray with you and try to discern with you? You need specific applications. So I don't know who, there's no categories, but just there are some people in your life, it's like, don't throw the pearls to the pigs. They're going to trample the pearls and turn and attack you. So that's the exception. But where does this leave us? Well, when it comes to judgment, never let someone else's failure make you feel like a success. Just don't. Don't live there. And I want you to imagine this week a different life. Imagine celebrating what God has given others. Just like that person you're jealous of, that person you're judging, you're trying to find any fault. Did you see the small ding in their brand new Mercedes? Did you see that? Just dump that. Celebrate what God has given others. Leverage what God has given you. Imagine this week holding yourself to a far stricter standard than you hold others. If you want something that will begin to change your family life today after lunch, just do that. I'm going to hold myself. Examine yourself before you start to say, hey, you know when you? Imagine not standing in judgment, but bending to help. What can I do? What can I do? I don't know everything. I'm not better, and I'm not even sure I'm right, but what can I do to help? And then imagine never letting someone else's failure make you feel like a success. See, if you start to do that, there's a different kingdom coming in your life and in the world. Let's pray. Father, thanks for your grace. Thank you. I'm a judger by nature. Have mercy on me. Help us discern, not judge, to bend to help. It's a tough teaching, God. You love us. The ground is level at the foot of the cross. None of us comes to you with anything in our hands other than the need for forgiveness and grace. And so help us to extend that to others, to love them, to help them, to bring truth to bear in our life and truth to bear in their life. And Father, will you help us to look inside and look up before we look at others. And just help us with this hard teaching. In your kingdom come, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. In Jesus' name.